Welcome to episode 77 of The Route, presented by Jobs in Sports. The Route is a glorified sports business coffee chat that has a new guest every episode as they share their experiences and route in sports. I'm Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. So, as usual, just two things to cover before we get into today's guest. If you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast or follow the podcast depending on the platform you're on. We're also on YouTube now, so if you're viewing us there, just subscribe to our White Whale marketing channel, and we have a whole The Route playlist, so you can see all of our episodes that have been done with video. And building off that as well, follow us on social media at The Route Sports. So major platforms would be LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, I think TikTok. We have a bunch of different ones, so whatever you're interested in, you can find us there. But with that, I think we can now get into today's guest since that's done. So, introducing our guest today, he's joining us from the UK, and he is tasked with developing the corporate strategy for Pickleball England, strategy and development advisor, James Chaudry. Welcome to The Route. How's it going?
Chris, great to be on here.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to finally discuss your route on the podcast. So I'm excited to get going. The way I like to start every single episode, it's fairly simple and fairly similar as well. Take us through your route. So where did it begin and how did we get here today?
Absolutely. Well, Chris, love the podcast, listen to you a lot, so really appreciate being on. My route is, I guess, similar to some people in sport, but with having an athlete's background, but also using education and a proper institution in the States to really get into the business side of it. So, as a bit of background, played tennis on the ITF tours, both junior and senior. Unfortunately, injuries hampered me, so ended up going to college in the US on scholarship. Spent 4 years at Mississippi State playing tennis, got an undergrad in marketing, and wanted to play again full time. And with at least having a degree behind me, I knew I could get back into the business side of sport. And I always knew that I wanted to help make sport a better landscape, having an athlete's perspective. Couple of years on tour and working in London, developing a new tennis club. And I realized that I still needed more business acumen, and I wanted to build my network within the sports industry.
Mm-hmm.
So ended up attending the University of South Florida in Tampa, and the Vinnick Sport and Entertainment Management program. Brilliant program there, for the fact that not only do you get an MBA and a master's in sport and entertainment management, but you also work alongside it, and that's built into the curriculum. So you have a residency placement with one of the pro sports teams, leagues, or brands in and around the Tampa area. And you do a lot of sort of remote consulting work for brands or rights holders that the program brings in to have special projects done. Mm-hmm. So that was my initial route into really understanding the academic side of the business landscape and sort of testing the waters and getting a feel for what it's like day to day. I worked at minor league baseball's league office in St. Petersburg. And after that, moved on to an agency based in Los Angeles. That agency's Premier Partnerships. Premier Partnerships works with rights holders all around the globe on their sponsorship offering. And it was really an area that I wanted to double down in and really focus myself in. Sponsorship sales, developing marketing strategies that had commercial benefits for both brands that were coming in to sponsor and also building sustained revenues for rights holders as well. Unfortunately, as with a lot of people, COVID hit the industry pretty hard, and I moved back to the UK due to visa reasons, and I ended up being connected with Pickleball England. I had very rarely been exposed to pickleball, even in the US, and it was growing pretty quickly. But as soon as I moved back here, it sort of seemed to take off in the US. And at that point, a lot of people in my network were either playing or having something to do with pickleball. And I got introduced to the founder and the board at Pickleball England, and from that point came in as a consultant and really wanted to help them grow the sport over here in the UK. So having a tennis background definitely helps, and being in the UK, growing up with that tennis background, understanding some of the areas that need to be navigated with Sport England and trying to develop a racket sport in the UK. I understood that from a player's standpoint, so I fitted quite nicely into their framework and have been working with them since January.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, and that's a great route to kind of just dive into things right away. I typically like to go back to the beginning, right? So then we kind of go in the correct flow of things. Also, you're touching on how you previously had tennis experience, right? You're saying how you're competing, and then obviously you had interest in going into the sports industry. That initial decision to go from the UK to the States for school was obviously based due to collegiate sport. Also, was it, hey, sports business is fairly prominent in the States, and I think that'd be a great way to get my foot in the door, or was it just that was where the scholarship was?
Really good question. I think I was solely focused on tennis, and my mind was tennis until injuries hit, and I think it gave me a different perspective on life, and understanding that you can't really control everything in life. And having gone to Mississippi State and finally understanding the enormity of collegiate sports, and that the big four leagues in the US, how much attention they were getting versus say soccer in the UK is really the bread and butter over here, and rugby to some extent, and cricket. But just the coverage and the enormity of sport, both from a participation and from a business standpoint, across pretty much all of the major sports in the US was definitely an attraction. Couple that with the fact that the opportunities to get scholarships for some of these programs, or for me initially it was my way in was I still loved being in and around tennis. My aim was to be an assistant coach and still carry on further education. But if you do your research thoroughly, you start understanding different sports management programs, for example, and what their strengths are. And once an opportunity to attend University of South Florida and getting that real hands-on experience on the business side of things, I couldn't justify going in and being a coach somewhere else when ultimately I really wanted to be able to affect change. So it was a little bit of the research. It was a little bit of being in the US initially for undergrad and playing tennis there, and just understanding that there are so many very good sports management programs in the US that it really made sense to venture over the Atlantic and base myself out of the US.
Yeah, no, and there's a few things I can get into right from there where, I guess the first one, because I think it would be a little more simple, because, you're saying how you're coming from the UK and then you end up in Mississippi State, which always kind of seems interesting, because I think we had a guest who did something similar where I think she was from Scotland and she had a scholarship for golf in the States. And then she ended up at some, I think, Midwest or Southern university that, she's never visited the States. So I'm kind of curious how Mississippi State came about and what that culture shock was, right? Because I'm sure people listening, whether they're finishing school in North America and moving over to European sport, or vice versa, what is that like? Because that's always interesting, I bet.
Well, I'll say this: I was extremely well traveled with the tennis before I went to the States anyway, and I'd been in and out of the States a lot because of tennis. But moving to the deep South and Mississippi definitely was a cultural experience, and one that I hadn't experienced before. I loved my time there, absolutely loved it, and the university was great. The athletics program is amazing, and I think the thing that, outside of being an extremely good tennis program, and that historically they've had a very, very good high level tennis program, I think the amount that the average student and the average person in and around Starkville or Mississippi cares about Mississippi State athletics and the sports that go on there was a really big attraction. Coming from the UK, I couldn't understand why you would need a stadium of 80,000 seats for a university game. Like that seemed absurd to me. And my first Mississippi State football experience was absolutely mind-blowing, that people were turning up in droves and there were thousands outside of the stadium waiting for university athletics. And I think the power that comes with being in the Southeastern Conference, that definitely had a huge play in me moving to Mississippi State, as well as obviously the amount that was being invested back into athletics. Also had a really, really strong coaching team and a strong team in general. I think that 90% of our team throughout my entire time there was either European or international.
Wow.
So I wasn't the only one from Europe coming into a completely new cultural experience. I think having others around me as well going through that same experience was really good to have. But it was different. It was different for sure, and I loved my time there. And I definitely grew as a person, but very different to being over here in the UK.
I completely believe that, because I lived in the States for 1 year, and obviously I'm Canadian and I live in Ottawa, born and raised. And obviously when I thought of moving there, right, with my parents, like, oh, it's close enough English, right? They're like, well, maybe a little accent change, you'll be fine. But the culture shock, even though it's maybe 8-hour drive, was huge to Boston. So I could only imagine from UK to the deep south. So that's very interesting. And even just in the note where this is something that I've discussed in meetings, or even just with friends on the side, where you think of 80,000 people going to a college game or university. I still don't even understand how they kind of define it differently there, but it's crazy, because we have a game here in Ottawa for the two universities where it's 20,000, where it's all, like, the two competing schools in the city they play, and people aren't even watching the game. It's more of an event. But then every other game only has like a couple, 100, maybe 50 people. But it's interesting, and that's kind of where the whole interesting dynamic of sports business, where it depends on where you get in and where you go to, right? So that's actually something I wanted to build on as well, right? Where you're talking about, your university experience in the sports management programs, and that's a question that seems to come up a lot, right? Where people are like, hey, how do I pick the right program for me, right? Where we had, I believe, a guest last week at the time of this recording, I should say, and they're from Germany, and they had more of a practical education, right? Where they were directly working with the German sporting or governing body of sports, and they would directly get internships with, Porsche, Bundesliga, different clubs like that. Whereas in Canada, you kind of do your education, you can do a co-op if you wish, but then in the States, it's directly, hey, we're pumping you straight into, these sports teams or leagues, like you're saying. So I'm curious how that worked for you, or what you suggest to others when you speak to them about which route to go for education.
Yeah, I think a lot really depends on what you're really wanting to achieve. I think each individual's journey is different and should be different for a number of different factors. For me, I really wanted to get in and build my network, right? I was very, very tennis focused, and my network was very large in tennis, but it didn't really go outside of that. I knew a few people in a couple of different rights holders globally, but that was about it. Even a lot of the brands that I knew, they've still played heavily in tennis. And for me to challenge myself and get out of that bubble, I needed to really be in a program that worked with different types of sports, different rights holders. And another thing for me was just the amount of work that I could do alongside it. I think for me, this stems with all forms of education, no matter what field you're in. Being in the classroom is great in the way that you're going to learn a very structured way of doing things. But there's no substitute for that real world experience. So you need to use the education as a reference point. But
Mhm.
so many situations arise when you're in the workplace that are completely different and you can't study for. And I
Yeah.
think it's that sort of experience that you get. And University of South Florida very much helped me with that. You know, you learn to put out fires on the fly, whether you have that experience or not. You know,
Yeah.
you're previous experience to it or not. You know,
Mhm.
you're part of a team that are trying to problem solve in that industry, and I think that was really important for me and really helped me grow. I always wanted to be on the commercial side, sort of whether it be marketing strategy to create, marketing or commercial strategies to create sustained revenues,
Mhm.
sponsorship, that sort of stuff. Um, so a lot of that is, problem solving and, trying to think through a strategic lens, right? How does this property and this brand align? And for me, for me, that played a huge part in where I was going to go.
Yeah.
Some people may be very focused on being part of a media team or digital broadcast or social media, and that would require maybe a different program. But for me, I knew that the University of South Florida was the right fit, and I was very much willing to not be a tennis coach
Mhm.
alongside it because the experience was for to get the most inclusive experience, I had to give that up.
Yeah, no, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Where, obviously we didn't do the same thing. That's kind of the beauty of the route, where everyone kind of does something a little different. Where, I got an education and I got a business degree. It wasn't even related to sports. I just knew I wanted to go into sports after.
Yep.
But then when I wasn't in class, like I was trying to, go for coffee chats, network, and different things, and that's how I kind of got my way in. And sometimes where I see an issue, at least maybe in regards to Canadian students, because that's different than the American universities, I speak to like students and sometimes they go to like a sport management program or undergrad, I should say, a little different here in Canada. And then um, usually that leads to maybe a ticketing job because they
Mm-hmm.
don't have the other business background, and which is good because that's a great foot in the door. But then sometimes what I've noticed from conversations, they're like, "Oh, I haven't gone enough job opportunity, so I'm going to go do a master's in it again." We're almost doubling down on the exact same education, I'd say. So I'm glad that to hear that you're saying, hey, it's really much more on the experience, because I agree with that. Because at the end of the day, someone said this on a previous podcast as well. In their 20, 25 years of experience, they're like, I don't think anyone's actually asked me for my degree or my grades,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
And they're like, I'm sure if they asked, like they'd want proof. But to this day, only thing they care about is my experience. And then that kind of resonates when you think of it, right? Because everyone's always kind of focused on, hey, well, like what degree I need these grades. But in reality, maybe it's depending where you are. It's an interesting discussion on its own. But yeah.
No, I completely agree, and I think it goes back to the point I was sort of talking about earlier. Is really, you know the education will give you a foundation,
Mhm.
right? But if the experience on the side of it is going to be really, really important, and whether that is at internships or whether it's trying to get a ticket job on the side or whatnot,
Yeah.
that side of things is learning on the job is as important, if not more important, than actually having that degree or that piece of paper.
Yeah.
The difference is some universities and some programs can help with both, and some
Mhm.
are more educationally focused. And I do think I definitely didn't see myself in this side of it, but there are going to be academic programs that will allow you to become more of an academic and a researcher within the sports business industry.
Mhm.
And I think that will play a really important part in the evolution of sports business as well.
Yeah.
For me, it was always on the practical side, so less
Yeah.
classroom, more practical. And
No, I completely agree. I'm the same way in that sense. And then an interesting point that you kind of brought up a few times already is in regards to, you were very um, interested in building that network, right? You've touched on that a few times now. So obviously that was part of the reason of going to South Florida. But obviously once you go to South Florida, it's not just going to come to you, right? So how did that building of the network start working out? Was it going to networking events? Was it coffee chats? Was it like, how did that go about? So people listening, they're like, okay, like I can do this. I'm in my third, fourth year. second, first, whatever of university, what can they do to actually start building their network to learn from you?
I think that's there's no magic answer
Yeah.
to that question, and I think everyone's comfortable in their own ways.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say get used to being a little uncomfortable,
Okay.
right? And by that I mean have the courage to go and give an elevator pitch to someone in the industry, right? Know that you've got 30 seconds to try and impress someone. So make sure you've done your research and you can add value to that person. I get, loads of LinkedIn requests or requests to speak at certain things, or can I give my advice, or do I know of any job opportunities? If I was answering all of them all day, I wouldn't be able to do any other work. So I think the most important thing, when people come to me with a bit of advice or a little tidbit, I find that really interesting, because they're always the ones that have done a little bit of research, understand what I'm doing, or really trying to create a purposeful conversation, and not just someone reaching out blindly, trying to get a connection or get a chat when there's no real substance to it. So I think do your research, and don't be scared of reaching out, but just make sure you've got something of substance to talk about or to. I think that's probably the most important part of it. Outside of that, I think there's the one other thing. Like, I've always been very true to myself, and whether people like my personality or they don't, I'm going to be me, because then they know where I stand and vice versa.
Yeah.
So it's not, for me, it's never trying to be someone I'm not. You're either going to want to talk to me because I'm being me and I can have these conversations, or it's just not going to be a fit, and that's also okay. The one thing that, and I said this earlier, is have a little bit of courage. Is in the sports industry, probably 99% of all the questions that you ask are going to be, the answer is going to be no, or you're going to be ignored. And that's whether that be in sponsorship or ticket sales or anything like this. The answer is going to be no. So be okay with getting no's, but try and maximize your chances to get a yes, or at least to get a maybe, or a conversation started.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with all that. And there's some interesting tidbits to touch on there where even, I think, 2 days ago on Sunday, I had a barbecue with friends, and that was a topic that came up. And obviously, everyone's from all different types of background, right? Like social work, business, e-commerce, etc. And I don't know how it came up, but then they started talking about interviewing, right? And whether you should be yourself or not. And some of them were like, oh, no, you got to just give the perfect answer. I'm like, personally, I think that's a load of crap, because eventually, if you guys aren't the right fit, it's going to see through, right? And then you guys are just going to be in a misty situation where you hate your job or they hate you, or vice versa. And it just kind of gets like that's not how you want to go about it. And in regards to building your network and LinkedIn, that's a great point, because I remember when I was in university, I'd see classmates and they'd have, I don't know, 800, connections. I'm like, wow, like we're in second year university. I just made my LinkedIn. Like, how do you have so many connections? And obviously they're just adding. And one of the issues I had in university with networking was I don't know what to ask, right? I didn't know how to actually, have something of substance that, let's say I reached out to you. What would I say to James, right? It would be like, hey, how's it going? No, you're not going to answer that. So once I actually started seeing the value in people actually responding was, hey, like, let's go for a coffee chat, or hey, I have this idea, or hey, I guess now with a podcast, hey, do you want to come on the podcast? And people see value where they're like, yeah, like I'll come on the podcast. And that's how you make the genuine connection, where that someone told me this, I think maybe my first job in sports, where they're like, it's all about like the value exchange, right? Even when it comes to networking. As you're saying, you have a bunch of people reaching out to you, but the one that's going to stick out where it's almost more worth your time, as bad as that sounds, but that's the reality of it, right? So very, very interesting. And then regarding to building your network, obviously, you touched on the different advice or tips or things that you've done. How did that actually get you into future positions, right? Did you meet someone, or was it something that you just applied to? How did those positions come about?
That actually, this ties it around perfectly with my sort of current gig. So I actually got introduced to Pickleball England through someone I connected with on an email chain from a university, connection. Basically, long story short, you know, we were we were connected via people, big email chain of people that were going to be guest speakers on
Mhm.
something, and one of the consultants on there, uh, US guy now based in the UK, and he has a guy named John Burkhart, huge character,
Mhm.
great person, does a lot of live talks and works, consults for some brands and whatnot. Brilliant, brilliant person. And we connected one on one, and there were a lot of synergies between what I do on the sponsorship side and what he does. And he said, "Oh, I'm working, helping a group called Pickleball England. Have you ever played?" And they said, "Oh, funny, I've played once or twice, and I see it growing." And he's like, "Let me connect you with Pickleball England because they've got a couple of things going on, and you seem like the perfect person that would be able to offer some advice." And that is essentially how I even got connected with Pickleball England. It was just through my network and getting those mutual introductions. It wasn't something that I was even seeking out. So it's network plays a huge part in the sports industry. The age old saying of it's who you know, it's who you know, not what you know,
Mhm.
is is so true in the sports industry.
Yeah.
And that's why, making sure you, even within your network, once you've established a network and you've connected with certain people, make sure to check in with relevant information every once in a while, or tag them in something that is absolutely relevant to what they're doing that could be of interest,
Mhm.
just so you know that you have these mini little touch points. Really, really important, and you never know what that might lead to, as I did with Pickleball England.
Yeah, no, and like that's the funny part about it. Even maybe going back to the discussion about the barbecue I had with friends on the weekend, right? They're all talking about interview process, and obviously, maybe people listening who are younger and kind of starting their career, obviously they're about the interview process. I find once you're in, and then if you look at changing positions or going to different organizations, it's like you're saying, it's from your network, right? Whether it's an email chain, whether it's maybe a former boss or former colleague, the way you're going to kind of get into all these different organizations is all about who you know. And it's crazy, even just some of the stories that I've heard on the podcast about how positions have come about for people where it seems like it's the oddest little thing where they're like, oh, we ran into each other in university, or someone who was in my class recognized me, and then it's that little bit of familiarity where people are like, you know what, we're going to take you because there's like a little in and we see value, and that's how you kind of stick out of the crowd, right? So I
Absolutely.
definitely see that. um and then, yeah, do you want to maybe talk about your position a bit more? What does that look like? Because obviously that's kind of exciting times for you guys.
Yeah. No, Pickleball England's so it was founded a few years ago,
Mm-hmm.
as basically by people that worked in the States, and British people. Karen Mitchell really heads it up, and she moved back this way, and wanted to bring the game of pickleball back from the US. And
Mm-hmm.
although it was, I say established, although the odd person played it over here, there wasn't really a presence.
Mm-hmm.
And Karen and a couple of others came together and said, "Look, we need to create an organization that oversees it." So Pickleball England was created. Now, there were a couple of other organisations around the UK that were trying to introduce pickleball, but it really wasn't something top of mind.
Mm-hmm.
So Karen very much said, "Look, without stepping on your toes, can we help? What can we do? We really want to create this organisation and really push pickleball over here. We've played it a lot in the US, and I've got a good network of people over here playing." And that's sort of how Pickleball England was founded. Um, Now, as membership started to grow and more people were starting to play, there was a realization that, okay, this needs to become not just a very small not-for-profit, but it needs to evolve, and it needs to become a national governing body. That way, there can be funding for the organization and really help the sport grow. And that's sort of when I was introduced. It was during the stage of, right, we are looking to file to become a national governing body for the sport. How we understand the process or the steps that are set out by Sport England, but how can we put together a strategy, an overarching strategy? How can we, really try and penetrate different markets? How can we encourage, not only participation, but people to share their experiences of pickleball? And while there were definitely existing initiatives in place, it's a case of how can we build them out? And as John connected me with Karen and Pickleball England, that's how I sort of grew into it. And they invited me down to play with them and learn the sport through their eyes. And I fell in love with the sport. As a tennis player, there's a lot of similarities while still being some differences. And the community within pickleball was really, really strong, and everyone. To me, it seems more like a community sport, and it holds a lot of community values where everyone wishes each other well, whereas some other individual sports can be a little bit toxic. So I fell in love with that sort of community and atmosphere, and then I said, right, how can I help? How can my experience really help? And that's where I worked with Karen, and John came in and out with some of the marketing initiatives, and we tried to build this 5-year strategic plan that ultimately is being included and sent to Sport England to help file for national governing body status.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because when you think of like national governing bodies, or just when you think of, for instance, the first thing that comes up for me when I think of a governing body is like Hockey Canada, Soccer Canada, right? And those seem like bodies that have been there forever, right? They're like, oh, when the sport started, that's when they were there, right? And to just kind of hear you kind of explain that, like the starting off of a governing body, and in recent memory, right? It's very interesting to be like, huh, interesting. Like I didn't realize how that process worked, because you're like, oh, it was just always established, it was always there, right? So that's very interesting on its own. And then at the end there, you're kind of touching on how can you help, right? Grow the game. So I know you go on about corporate strategy, but how do you help? Do you mind maybe getting into that without kind of maybe sharing your little insights inside that are more for internal use?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we're unfortunately the world runs on money, right? And for realistically, for Pickleball England to grow, there needs to be sustained funding coming in through multiple different avenues, and that's what I really came in to start thinking about, right? How can Pickleball England, as a not-for-profit organisation, generate revenues that can then be ploughed back into the sport and help the sport grow? Now, the value proposition of pickleball is it's a sport that a lot of people enjoy from a social standpoint. There's low barriers to entry for the fact that the sport is fairly cheap. It's played on a court the size of a badminton court, so there's already courts in existence. If you play indoors, there's loads of sports halls with badminton courts, and you can fit, I believe, 4 pickleball courts on a tennis court. So there's with very little alterations. Now the only thing is you would need to bring in pickleball nets, which can be temporary. So the value proposition of the sport to get people outside and active is really strong. So for me, it's a case of, right, I've worked with a lot of very professional rights holders that work at the highest ends, but this is really fun for me to really work on something that's grassroots. How do we generate sustainable funding to make sure that this sport grows at grassroots level? So national governing body status is going to be really, really important. Also, how can we work with other organizations or other racket sports to collectively grow the sports and work together? How do we best utilize a lower barrier to entry to get more people active? And it's just a case of, right, I'll come in, try and connect the dots. Sport England wants to get people moving again. How can we put together campaigns that make people move again? with that, how do we generate events where not only do people come in because they want to try pickleball, but they also really want to help grow the sport, go back to their tennis clubs or their local parks or their recreation centres, leisure centres,
Mm-hmm.
and also say, oh, you know what, we should start pickleball here. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's trying to figure out the right models at grassroots level to make sure that money's coming in and people are playing and there is enjoyment there is really where a majority of the focus is. National governing body status will really help with that, because I think we hit on so many of the criteria that make this a sport that is socially inclusive
Mm-hmm.
and will get people active and healthy again.
Yeah, no, and that's all a good point, because that's actually something you said at the beginning that I'm going to get into after this in regards to growing sport in the UK. But like you see it oftentimes where, I'm going to use Canada as an example because that's obviously where I am. But you think a country of the size of Canada, right? We'd see more, let's say, dominance or even more notoriety around soccer. But only recently that's taken place because there was issues at the grassroots levels. It's kind of hearing you speak on that is pretty interesting, right? Because only now we're starting to see, like I was speaking to someone the other day, they're like, oh, I wish I was playing soccer now in Canada because the infrastructure is actually there. So it's interesting how, you're speaking on how you're actually going to try planning and growing the sport, because obviously grassroots and, communal activities is really how it kind of pushes it to actually get it to the next level. So that's very interesting. And in regards to maybe a question that I had earlier, and it's kind of a great flow into it, is growing sport in the UK. So you kind of touched on it earlier about, comparing US to UK sports and how when you entered there, obviously there's college sport, there's the major four in the US, but then, in the UK, it's mostly soccer, maybe a little bit of rugby and cricket, as you said. Why do you think there's not a higher prominence of other sports like compared to North America, where it seems like there's a little bit of everything?
That is a great question. If I would love to give you a definitive answer, because I'd probably be making a lot more money if I could give you every answer to that question. But
For sure.
no, I think there's a lot of reasons why, and I think that every generation that goes through, I guess, has a different priority and where they're wanting to spend their time or money or energy. And soccer definitely has been the dominant sport, has been for years. I don't see that ever changing. But it's a case of, right, if you look at some of the other sports that have been really big over the years, tennis included, and don't get me wrong, I absolutely love my tennis through and through. But you look at some of the statistics and the people that are following tennis or participating in tennis, and it's aging out. There is a problem with engagement. And what you see with the sports that are really, really successful is they have very comprehensive strategies with engaging people digitally. And you see that throughout especially in the US, where so much time and energy is spent on social media positions and digital medias and website development and all the tech around it. I don't think that's happened as much over here. And I think there's one major reason for it has been traditionally the way that sport is consumed in Europe versus the US. And I'll use this as an example. If you take soccer, which is by far the biggest sport over here, and we'll take Southampton Football Club, my local club, and love going down to St Mary's to watch a game. But I turn up if kickoff's at 3:00, I turn up at 2:55. I get into my seat. I sit in my seat for 45 minutes exactly. I don't leave, don't engage with anything else. I then have 15-minute break to go and get a coffee or a beer or whatever it is, and then I'm sat in my seat for the next 45 minutes. And then the first thing I'm thinking about is how do I get out of the stadium as quickly as humanly possible?
Yeah.
And that is the way that people have consumed sport over here for so many years that it's hard to break those sort of barriers. So all the interest is actually on the product on the field or on the court or whatnot. Whereas when you go to the US, there is a lot of focus around all the social aspects of what sport brings, all the sponsor activations, tailgating, being there for ages before. I would be at an NFL game and I'd spend 20 minutes walking around concessions to see what was there and, watching the TV screens. And that doesn't happen over here. And it's a slow integration over here of people. Or, younger generations want a more social experience or a more. So I think it will change with time, but that hasn't really pushed over from the States as quickly, and that's why I think some of the other sports that may be a little bit more social haven't grown as quickly because the business side of it or the marketing side hasn't been in place. There isn't huge fan activation zones. There isn't encouragement to get to the stadium 2 hours before. It's still, get there 5 minutes before. And it's the same across all the sports. And I think that if I was to look at the sports landscape specifically in the UK, I think cricket is doing a phenomenal job of that. But outside of that, I think a lot of the other sports need to step up. Cricket has tried to evolve with shorter formats of the game, which has gone down really, really well, because one of the big issues was trying to sit through a whole day of cricket and all this sort of stuff, similar to what baseball's experiencing in the States. And then also there's a new format called the 100 over here, which you have both men's and women's playing back to back, and they compete under the set. So, and it's a different format of cricket again. So they have been adapting, and you're seeing a younger audience and people that are more engaged with the sport and everything going on around than maybe some of the other sports. And I think that's one of the major obstacles that sport over here has to overcome. I do think there will be a push from the younger generations to have more social experiences at events, and I think that they will consume not just sport but entertainment in a different way than maybe previous generations have. But I do think that there needs to be an emphasis on looking at sport as an entertainment and a media play rather than a product on a field or a court, etc.
100%. And that's that's a discussion that's come out about. Oh, that was very Canadian right there, but that's a discussion point that has come out often, I should say, in regards to maybe some of the guests we've had on the podcast, where the way sports is changing, it's not just about the products on the field anymore, right? And that's where you're starting to see, people, or sports specifically, let's say in the US, focusing on themselves as maybe like a media or broadcast entity. So that's pretty interesting, where even I'll use my home here as an example, as you did. So obviously here in Ottawa, we have an NHL team, hockey, hockey's king here, but it is extremely cold here in January, right? So similar to you, when you go to a Southampton match, when we go to a Senators match, let's say me and my dad, we show up maybe 20 minutes ahead of time. We get to our seat, sit down, maybe get a coffee because it's so cold. And then once it's done, you're running home because your car's probably frozen. So you're getting a heater, right? So that's starting to evolve, where, we got a Canadian football club a couple of years ago, and their fan experience is completely different from the NHL team, even though it's the same city. So this team is much more downtown, actually just across the street, but it's downtown, where they almost shut down the whole, let's say, neighborhood, and they have what do they call it? Like game day festivities. So they have DJs, they have like different games people can play, and it's really almost like a tailgate in the States, where it's very much more experiential. People are having a good time, and a lot of people that, like, even let's say I have friends that go to the CFL games, they're not even fans of football. They just know it's almost like a Canadian experience, because we're called the Red Black, so everyone wears plaid. They're cutting, they're chainsawing timber, and everyone's drinking beer out of boots, where people really just want to have that experience rather than actually just watch the product on the field. So that's probably why this new team is doing so well, right? Where football in the past has failed twice in Ottawa, but now that it's much more experiential, it seems like it's actually going a long way and doing very well. So That's very interesting points that you mentioned, because obviously we're seeing it here firsthand. And there's one other note that I have on that, because obviously with this new generation, it's changing, right? Where before, you're a diehard fan of your dad's team, and you just kind of continue on that front. And I remember a statistic, I think it was, if a 9-year-old's wearing a ball cap with a logo on it, I think it's greater than 90% chance that's their team for life.
Yep.
But what they're noticing now is the younger generation, they're fans of individuals, right?
Yes.
So that's where it's starting to change, where that's good for my business, because we're working with athletes and growing their brands. But that's something that maybe leagues and stuff have to start pushing those stores, or even pushing them as individuals, or even just influencers, as you want to say, to kind of push the sport a little further. So it's an interesting time for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really interesting point. And I think that even my time in the US, I mean, I first moved to the US in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
I think about a lot of my friends who, take the NBA, for example. They were Heat fans when LeBron moved to Miami.
Yeah.
They were Cavs fans when and that happens a lot more. And I think the younger generations are starting to care more about individual athletes, and especially around social causes and whatnot, and what particular people stand for. I think that will play a really big role as to as an athlete, who's going to be successful from a media standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But no, it is really, really interesting to see how that's going to evolve. And I think the US is in prime position to take advantage of it, because I think there's some business parameters from an operations standpoint that allow that to happen. So, for example, salary caps, and making sure that that it's not too one-sided to certain teams, and all teams have an equal chance. I think if you look at the recent news about Lionel Messi over here in Europe, I think that things like this will. There were only a couple of teams that could afford to have Lionel Messi on their team, and they're already the biggest clubs in the world anyway, with the best players. So there's even more of a disparity, and that will create a bit of a problem over here in Europe. But I do think the US is in a really good space in terms of being able to, if athletes are changing teams, that's really good for the league to see, and the teams. Obviously, you're seeing social media follow it, going to different players and team accounts, boosting their sponsorship income, or their reach, because they've got certain athletes on their team.
Yeah.
It might be a little different over here. Unfortunately, Southampton is never going to be able to afford Lionel Messi or the next Messi that comes up. Outside of some billionaire from somewhere in the world hopefully buying the club, it's never really going to happen, right? And I think that's where comes back to your point and my point about making it experiential. You need you need people over here to follow the teams, because their game day offering or their social media strategy is so well put together. They want to follow Southampton football because it's influencing not just people's lifestyles, but what's happening in local areas and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah. No, and it's just an interesting discussion to have as a whole, right? Where it's going back to previous podcast guests. It might even be the one that's going to be releasing today at the time of this recording, where we were chatting about transfer fees, right? Especially in Europe, because personally, I'm a fan of like the sporting landscape, especially in soccer in Europe, where you're responsible for your performance, right? If you're not doing well, you're going to get relegated. If you're doing well, you're going to go to Champions League or Europa League, or then there's even the battle in the middle of the table, right? For, just those standings, right? Where it's almost little competitions within itself, which I'm a big fan of, because you see the fans engaged at all levels, right? Where I do think there is some type of experience that is being provided there, right? Where oftentimes you see, I'll use Ottawa as an example again. The hockey team here, when they started doing poorly, the owner wasn't very great. It still isn't, I should say. But the fans basically boycotted the stadium, right? Because they're at the bottom of the standings. The product isn't good. So like, hey, we're not going anymore. But if there's some type of relegation system in place, people will be like, oh no, we don't want to see our team leave. There's that experience, right? Where one of the guests was saying when he was working for Wolfsburg, I believe, they're in a relegation match. And even though it's probably not a good place to be in, it was one of the most amazing experiences of his career because it's either they stay in the Bundesliga or he loses his job essentially.
Yep.
And I think there's a happy medium between North American and European that I think will come into play because, like you're saying about transfer fees and Leo Messi, it's getting to the extent now where it doesn't make sense, right? Where these transfer fees aren't really soccer based, right? They're much more media or jersey sales or even sponsorship where it doesn't, it's not fair, even though like life isn't fair, but it doesn't make like the sport competitive anymore, right?
No, you're right. That's the same in life, isn't it? The rich get richer.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, you need money to make more money, and that's sort of what it is. I completely agree. I love the idea of I love relegation promotion battles. I think that
100%.
is really good. As growing up European, I hate the idea of tanking that happens
Yeah.
in the States. But then I also think, in the States, it's forget the product that's on the court or the field or whatever. Some of the teams do a phenomenal job with their fan experience. So even when they're doing poorly, they still get butts and seats, as they call it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's where the really good, really, really top organizations separate themselves from the others.
Mm-hmm.
And normally those top organizations don't stay at the bottom of the standings for very long. They normally move up pretty quick because there's always excitement around it. The revenues that they're not getting because they're performing poorly on the court or on the field are being made up for because they're still getting 95% attendance and people are still spending a ton at the bars and all this sort of stuff. So I think there's a lot to be said for organizations that do a really, really good job of keeping their members and their supporters and their people happy. That needs to come over to the UK. And I think a little bit more of the on the field competitiveness, somehow that needs to be integrated back sometimes into the States.
100%.
So you're right, that sort of happy medium, but it's a difficult gap to bridge both ways. I think the fan experience will come over time in Europe, but I don't know how there can be performance incentives or to stop that in the States. I definitely don't have an answer for that one.
Yeah, no, and it's an interesting topic. Obviously, we can go about it forever, but I definitely think that's why. I think personally, I'm starting to see a rise in interest in European soccer here again. Obviously, maybe at least in Canada, it has to do with the Canadian national team actually being somewhat competitive now, and there's a new soccer league to develop Canadian talent, and obviously, like the Premier League seems to be like the big show in town where that's what people are paying attention to in Canada now, and I think, like you're saying, it's only going to get better in the future for, let's say, Premier League clubs, as they're going to probably have the best of both worlds, where it's going to end up being that happy medium, where here in North America, you're going to, like, for instance, I think baseball is going to have a huge drop-off with these new generations because it's too long, it's not engaging, and, like you're saying, it's similar to soccer where there's no salary cap, where it's boring, right? The rich get richer, and then there's no real excitement to go see a bottom standing team there, right? Unless they have a concert. But are you really selling baseball then if you're having a concert coming in, right? So what's your business at that point? So
and I don't mind that in the way that if they're thinking about themselves as an entertainment organization, I just think that you're definitely going to lose the purists. From the sport, but purists will always stay purists. I just think there's going to be less purists as the generations move through.
No, I agree.
But yeah, I mean, unless the format of some of these sports changes drastically, and I'll give an example. I think tennis is in a really bad place at the moment. I grew up. I'm a purist of tennis in a way, but I would be out of my mind to think that it should stay the way it is and the format should stay the same, etc., because no one's really engaging with it. And unfortunately, tennis is about to experience, in the next couple of years, the retirement of some of the greatest tennis players of all time, all at the same time.
Yeah.
And there isn't much of an interest in many people behind that. So I think tennis is in a really, really bad place. And I think you meant baseball's sort of similar. I think cricket was going through that for a little while, at least over here in the UK. There's a lot more cricket purists in India and some other nations as well. But so they reinvented themselves. They've got different formats. They're bringing a new audience to it, a younger audience, a more exciting product on the field, which means more excitement in and around the stands, and they redevelop that. And I think a lot of sports really need to take a look at themselves, and it's going to be a case of, are they too stubborn to change because a lot of the people at the top are purists, or are they going to understand that, innovation and change is inevitable? So you either embrace it, or you're going to go down losing a fight, and you might just bring down organizations or sports with it. So some tough conversations need to be had with a lot of sports.
No, I completely agree. And obviously I'm going to start ending the interview, but in regards to tennis, that is fairly interesting in regards to the impact that maybe even player branding could have in that sport, right? Would go a long way, especially with these high-level names retiring. And the last real hard-hitting question that I have, and then we can kind of get into maybe advice and stuff for those listening. Just from the topic we're talking about, let's say a baseball game and there's a concert. I'm just curious about your opinion here. Let's say from a business standpoint, let's say there's a, I don't know, Braves game. That's the team that comes to mind. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But let's say they're doing poorly that year and they're trying to get people in the stands. So like, hey, this big name band's coming to play. Come to this game. Obviously, that makes sense because that's going to drive ticket sales, etc. But then at that point, would it not make sense to not have a product on the field that day, right? To maybe just have the only event being shown a concert, right? Because at that sense, you still have to pay the players. You have to pay, refs, maybe, broadcasting. You know how it kind of all just it gets a little messy is what I mean.
I agree. So brings me back to the beginning. So I worked at minor league baseball, minor league baseball's league office for just over a year, I think. And so I understand the product from both sides. And it really depends on, let's say, where the Braves are in their maturity cycle, what they're trying to change, right? Is it you're trying to get new fans into the stadium, then throwing a concert with a band that's going to attract people that aren't necessarily their existing customer makes a huge amount of sense.
For sure.
Or is it a case of, right, we've built out some new fan experience initiatives, but we need people to try them. Yeah. So we put a concert on at the same time. Or is it a case of they're just not seeing enough, attendance is actually okay, but people aren't staying for long enough, so they're not getting that food and beverage revenue, right? So do we put a concert at the end so everyone stays through the ninth inning and we leave the bars open longer? So I think a lot depends on each team's what they're trying to achieve and why they would be throwing it. I think you're absolutely right. You can't just throw a concert for the sake of throwing a concert.
Yeah.
But trying to drive new people into a venue, to even if it is a different experience, and then providing a world-class experience for them when they're going in is a great way of people going, oh, actually, not been to the Brave Stadium before. This is really good. I'll come here to sink a few beers and watch a few innings of baseball, where once a week or something like that. So I think it just depends.
Yeah, and all those scenarios make a lot of sense, right? Because there's different maybe objectives at hand here. But then, I guess where the question was stemming from is, let's say a big ticket act. Let's say Drake. Drake's a big name, right? He pulls a lot of people. Do you think, at the sense, obviously, this is obviously starting to get hypothetical because Drake at a Braves game doesn't necessarily make sense.
But I don't know, if you put him in for a Hawks game as well, then he might be down there.
No, for sure. But
outside it. at most basketball games, NBA games. So.
Very true, especially here in Canada, right?
Yeah.
So I guess maybe the question: do you think obviously there's different things you got to look at in terms of like budgeting and what your actual initiatives are, but do you think there is maybe a cap on who teams are willing to bring in to pull people in, right? Because then the sense of, yeah, you maybe bring new people into the stadium, but maybe the cost of the act is so high, and the people that would be bringing in, maybe this is getting a little murky now, but honestly, it's just some of the things I think about. But anyways, we'll move on from that aspect because I was just going to go down a whole different rabbit hole. But
no, I think actually what your point is a very valid one, and I think that whether it be there are some stadiums, and I'll take Tampa Bay Lightning for example, that the arena, Amalie Arena, obviously hosts 31 NHL Tampa Bay Lightning NHL games, but they also host 40, 50, 60 concerts a year as well on different days to the games. So they're multi-purpose venues. Whether the Braves want to create a strategy that makes the stadium a multi-purpose venue, then great.
yeah.
But I think you're right. A lot depends. And yeah, Drake would probably sell out anywhere
Exactly.
without the need for baseball there or anything like that. So you make a good point. It's just how desperate are they to try and get people in and announce that their attendance is a little bit better?
For sure.
Yeah.
It was just more so I was just thinking of the thought process of, I'm sure internally everyone has their own limits, let's say, or even their own guidelines. But I was just maybe like thinking out loud here, like what the cap would be for, let's say, the Braves again. So they're like, hey, a musical act cannot like exceed this level of standing or this level of following, where it would just kind of overtake the whole experience of baseball still, right? So just one of the things I was thinking out loud. And to kind of end it all, kind of maybe wrap it up because it is all about the route. Obviously, you've experienced some amazing things over your career so far. Is there one story that maybe sticks out, whether it's your time in Mississippi, Premier, or even now with pickleball? Is there something that stands out? I was like, wow, like, I can't believe I get to do that for a living.
There's a lot of stories. I think that for me, I think day to day, you working with pickleball and what I'm doing with pickleball right now is a completely different space than I've been in before. Really, really enjoying it. But I think before that, I've worked with so many huge rights holders, LA Chargers, Bayern Munich, doing some Phoenix International Raceway, some really, really major clients in and around the States, just being a part of them, going to some of the events, networking with, the top executives at these rights holders is obviously pretty special, and you get a real insight into what's going on. But I think for me, it's how much of an impact can you make? So definitely my time at minor league baseball's headquarters for me was probably the most exciting, because we had, I wouldn't say a free reign, but we had a lot of space to play in, and worked on Hispanic and Latinx initiative that drove Hispanic and Latinx attendance across the states to outrageous numbers, way past what we could have ever imagined. And it went from a pilot program of just having 4 teams rebrand themselves for a couple of nights to having all of the teams approaching the league office to see if they can get this special branding, can they change their identity and all of this. So I think the amount of revenue that was generated because of essentially creating a more inclusive atmosphere and ballparks for people of different backgrounds was huge, because that was, to me, one of the biggest. And then the fact of working on sponsorship deals like Allegiant Airlines league-wide partnership. I was allowed a lot of freedom to really try and set out strategies to secure sponsors and putting all the research behind it. And the fact that not only do you get to create a strategy when I was really young in my career and put all the pieces together, but then to see it come to fruition, and then you see it all in, sports business journals and all of this massive partnerships. I think that those sort of things and those successes, both from an impact standpoint, more grassroots and local levels, to some of these major deals getting pushed through, is, for me, the excitement of seeing them come to fruition is definitely the stories that I hold. And I've got probably a few more, but
Mhm.
the top of my head can't spit them out.
No, that's amazing, because that kind of comes full circle, right? Where we're talking about just even at the beginning in regards to education and even just experience at the beginning of your career, and actually that problem solving is what kind of pushes you forward and gains you that expertise. So that's kind of interesting how that all comes full at the end. And the last thing that I like to ask everyone is, obviously we went forward in time as an old James were to look back on his career, what would stand out? Now, if we were to go back in time and you were to speak to an 18-year-old version of yourself, or even a student beginning in university now, what is a piece of advice that you would give them, whether it's related to career or even life advice? They're like, I wish I knew that sooner. Like, what is something that you think is valuable that you wish you knew earlier?
A few things. I'll go one that's sports business specific and one that's sort of life. Life one would be open to trying and new things, or experiencing new things from someone else's perspective.
Okay.
Because you can never grow as a person until you see something in someone else's shoes or try to think like someone else. And if you can put yourself in uncomfortable situations, or situations that will really challenge you as a person, you will grow a lot more, and you'll have a much better insight into everything in life because of it, because you've just stepped out of your comfort zone. I think that's important. And obviously that is very relevant in the sports industry as well, right? I went from tennis to minor league baseball. I knew nothing about baseball before going in there, and seeing a completely different market, and trying to think through someone else's lens, it was honestly the most personal growth I ever went through. I think the other thing is, and from a someone that's 18 and trying to get into the sports business world, is try not to say no. I know that sounds sort of like a lot of people will say that, but give yourself an opportunity to experience things that maybe you don't want to do, because you can then cross them off and guarantee that you don't want to do it. And, for example, you might not want to do ticket sales for your life, but hey, take an internship or volunteer at your university's ticket sale and just get that little bit of experience. Even if you don't want to do it, it's really, really good experience for you, and you can rule it out later. You say, I tried this, didn't like it, but during that time I actually generated $10,000 in revenue. You know what? That's a great little story to come out of something you didn't really want to do. And I think that one's an important. Just try and find a way to do a little bit of everything while you're still young, because once you start getting a bit older and you're generating a lot more experience down one particular avenue or channel, it's much harder to change. So try and do everything early and get that bit of experience and find out what you do and you don't like, because it gets harder and harder to change once you start working your way into one more specific vertical.
Yeah, that last point, like, I could not agree with that more, because I know I've said this probably if people listen to every single episode. I always touch on how I was in accounting before, and I got to the point where I absolutely hated my job in accounting, but I stuck through because I saw a quote where, if you don't know what you want to do in your life, do something you absolutely hate, because you're going to figure out really quick what you want to be doing, right? So that kind of got me down that path. And I was speaking to my friend who, he's done university. He's, probably been out a year or two or something like that. And he's at the point where he's like, hey, like, I don't really know what to do next. And I kind of told him something similar where I'm like, hey, just start flipping all these different stones, right? You're going to be gaining experience, and maybe there's even like something you can be putting on your CV that can be like, hey, like, I did this, or hey, I did that. But as you're flipping all these different stones, like you're saying, you're going to start figuring out, oh, I actually kind of like ticketing a little bit, or actually, I like corporate partnerships, or I like music, right? Where you're going to start figuring things out about yourself and what your skill sets are. So I could not agree with that more. And I think that's a perfect way to kind of cap it off. And unless there's anything else you'd like to share, I just want to thank you for coming on, and lots of great stuff. I got a bunch of notes as usual, which is always good.
No, Chris, really appreciate you inviting me on. Brilliant podcast. I probably won't listen to myself on this podcast. I'd rather listen to all of the other amazing guests that you have on. But no, really appreciate you taking your time today and inviting me on.
No, for sure. And fair enough. I have a hard time listening just because I hear my voice as well. So no, I appreciate it. And I know people are going to enjoy this episode. So thank you again.
No, thank you, Chris.